My younger brother slept with my wife, and for a brief, disorienting moment, I believed that was the betrayal I would spend the rest of my life trying to understand until I realized the real damage didn't come from what they did, but from what my parents asked me to do with it. I was standing outside a lawyer's office, watching my reflection blur against the glass as traffic moved behind me when my father called. And the calm in his voice felt so familiar it almost made the words easier to miss. "Your brother made a mistake," he said. "Don't make it worse. Be the bigger man." And it wasn't the words themselves that stayed with me. It was how easily he said them, as if my role in all of this had already been decided. I grew up in a house where everything had a place, even the things no one said out loud. And if you stayed long enough, you learned that order didn't just apply to furniture or schedules, but to people who they were allowed to be what they were expected to carry, and how quietly they were supposed to do it. My father was a pastor, the kind who didn't raise his voice unless it was from behind a pulpit, where calm authority could pass for compassion, and my mother moved beside him like she understood that keeping things steady was just as important as keeping them right, which meant that over time, peace became something we preserved more carefully than truth. Sam fit into that system in a way that looked effortless. He was the one people noticed first. The one who stayed after services to stack chairs or tune guitars, who remembered names, who laughed easily, and who made it feel like the church wasn't just something we attended, but something we belonged to. I didn't fit the same way, and for a long time I told myself that was a choice, that I preferred distance, that I had simply built a life outside of it. But the older I got, the more I realized that stepping back had never really been neutral. It had quietly defined my role just as much as Sam's involvement defined his. When something went wrong, Sam was the one people protected, and I was the one people trusted to understand, not because I was stronger, but because I was easier to ask. I didn't see it clearly back then, not in a way I could name, but I felt it in smaller moments, the way my father would look at me when things got complicated, not with concern, but with expectation. Like he already knew I would absorb whatever needed to be absorbed so that everything else could stay intact. And for the most part, I did. I built a life that made sense outside of them, a steady job, a small house I bought before I got married, a routine that didn't depend on Sunday mornings or community approval. And when I met my wife, it felt less like something dramatic and more like something that fit quietly, naturally, without needing to be explained. Looking back, that might have been the first sign I missed, because nothing in my family ever stayed simple for long, especially when it threatened the version of us everyone else believed in. And by the time I realized something was off, it wasn't because of a single moment. It was because too many small things had started lining up in a way that no longer felt accidental. It didn't happen all at once, and that's probably why I didn't question it sooner, because nothing about it looked dramatic on the surface. Just small inconsistencies that could have meant anything if you didn't put them side by side and let them sit there long enough to make a pattern. It started with a charge on our joint account, a boutique hotel about 20 minutes outside town, the kind of place people use for weekend getaways or quiet retreats. And when I asked her about it later that night, she didn't hesitate, didn't even pause to consider the answer, just told me it was part of a work thing that had run longer than expected. That should have been enough. But something about how easily it came out, how neatly it fit, stayed with me in a way I couldn't explain, like hearing a story that makes sense until you replay it in your head and realize you can't quite place where you've heard it before. So I didn't argue. I checked. Not in a frantic way, not in a way that felt like losing control, but slowly, deliberately. Going back through statements, timestamps, small details that didn't mean anything on their own until they started aligning too well to ignore. And then there was the camera. The one over the front door I had installed months earlier after a break-in down the street. Something practical, forgettable. Until I opened the footage from a night she had said she was out of town and saw a car pull into the driveway at an hour that didn't belong to anyone we knew. I recognized it before I even let myself admit it. The shape of it. The way it parked slightly off-center. The way the driver didn't hesitate before walking up to the door. Sam didn't knock. He let himself in, and the strangest part wasn't what that meant. It was how quickly everything else in my life rearranged itself around that single, quiet fact, like it had been waiting for me to notice. Because by the time I confronted her later that week, I wasn't asking a question anymore. I was confirming something that somehow had already been decided without me. They asked me to meet them after service that Sunday. And even before I walked into the restaurant, I could feel that this wasn't a conversation they were stepping into with uncertainty, but one they had already organized in their heads, as if the outcome mattered more than anything I might actually say once I sat down. It was the same place we'd gone to for years, tucked just far enough from the church to feel private but still familiar enough that nothing about it would draw attention, which in hindsight should have told me exactly what they were trying to do: keep everything contained, controlled, manageable. My father was already seated when I arrived, his posture straight, hands folded loosely on the table, while my mother sat beside him with the kind of stillness that wasn't calm so much as deliberate, like she was holding herself in place. My wife had stepped away to the restroom just as I sat down, and for a brief moment, it was just the three of us, the air between us heavy in a way that didn't need to be explained. My father didn't waste time. "There's something we need to talk about," he said, his tone steady, almost rehearsed. And I noticed he didn't ask how I was, didn't ask what I knew. He moved straight into what he had already decided needed to be said. "We're aware there's been a situation." The words sat there flattened, stripped of weight. My mother added quietly, "Sam has stepped down from his responsibilities at the church," as if that detail was meant to reassure me, as if the removal of a role somehow addressed what had actually happened. I let them speak, not because I agreed, but because I needed to hear how far they were willing to go without saying it plainly. It was a moment of weakness. My father continued, his eyes steady on mine, between two adults. "A failure. Yes, but not something that should define the rest of your lives if it's handled correctly." Handled. Like it was a situation to manage, not a betrayal to confront. I felt something in me shift, then not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way something settles when it finally finds its place. "And how exactly do you think it should be handled?" I asked, my voice even enough that it didn't give them anything to push against. My father didn't hesitate. "By choosing not to escalate it," he said, "by remembering what matters long term: family, stability, the church." My mother nodded, her voice softer, but no less certain. "Forgiveness is what allows things to heal." There it was, not a suggestion, an expectation. Not for me, but for the version of me they had already decided I would be. My wife returned to the table, then her expression searching my face, trying to read something I hadn't yet shown, and for a second, I wondered if she understood how little room there actually was for any of us to say anything real. In that moment, "You need to get past this," my father said more directly now, as if the conversation had reached its intended point. "Holding on to it will only do more damage." I looked at him, really looked this time, and what struck me wasn't anger or disappointment, but the complete absence of hesitation, like he had never considered another way this could go. "Would you be saying that," I asked slowly, "if Sam had done this to someone else's marriage?" For the first time, there was a pause. Not long, but long enough. And instead of answering, my mother exhaled quietly and said, "This doesn't have to destroy everything unless you let it. Unless I let it." The words lingered there, almost reasonable on the surface, and yet the more I sat with them, the clearer something became, not all at once, but in layers, like a pattern I had been part of for years finally coming into focus. Because this wasn't about what happened. It was about what they needed from me after it did. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my wallet, and placed enough cash on the table to cover the meal none of us had touched. And as I stood up, I realized I wasn't leaving because I didn't know what to say. I was leaving because, for the first time, I understood exactly what they were asking and exactly who they expected me to be. "Hope it was worth it," I said, not raising my voice, not looking at anyone in particular. Then I walked out before I had to hear how they planned to answer that. I didn't drive home right away after that, not because I needed time to calm down, but because there was a kind of stillness settling in that I didn't want to interrupt, like something that had been building for years had finally found a shape I could recognize if I just let it sit long enough. The parking lot behind the restaurant was mostly empty. the late afternoon light stretching across the pavement in long, uneven lines, and I remember leaning back in the driver's seat without turning the engine on, replaying the conversation not for what was said, but for what wasn't, because that was where the pattern had always been hiding. It wasn't the first time something had been minimized in that house, or reframed into something easier to carry, and the more I let myself trace it backward, the more those moments stopped feeling isolated and started lining up in a way that made them impossible to ignore. When I was 16, Sam backed his car into a neighbor's fence, and my father called it a lesson in responsibility, the kind of phrasing that softened the impact just enough to keep everything from escalating. While I stood there listening and realizing that consequences in our family were rarely about what happened, and more about who it happened to. Years later, when I disagreed with my father in front of a small group at church, nothing dramatic, just a different opinion on how something should be handled, I was the one pulled aside afterward, told that tone matters, that leadership required restraint, that being right wasn't as important as keeping the room steady. At the time, I accepted that. Not because I agreed, but because it seemed easier than pushing against something that never quite acknowledged itself. And that was the part I hadn't fully understood until now, that none of this had started with the affair, and none of it would end there either, because what my parents had asked of me at that table wasn't new. It was just clearer than it had ever been before. They weren't asking me to forgive because they believed it would heal anything. They were asking because I had always been the one who made things easier when they needed them to be, the one who didn't complicate the narrative, the one who could absorb what didn't fit and carry it quietly enough that everything else could stay intact. And sitting there in that car with the silence pressing in around me, I realized something that felt less like a decision and more like an acknowledgement I had been avoiding for years. I hadn't lost my place in that family that afternoon. I had finally seen it. And once you see something like that clearly, once it stops being a feeling and becomes something you can't unknow, there isn't really a way to step back into it the way you did before, which meant the question in front of me wasn't whether I could fix what had happened, but whether I was willing to keep being the person they expected me to be after it. By the time I got home, the house felt different, not in any obvious way. Nothing moved or out of place, but in the way silence can change once you understand what it's been holding. Like every room had been waiting for me to catch up to something it already knew. She was in the kitchen when I walked in, standing by the counter with her phone in her hand. And for a second, she looked like she might say something, like there was still a version of this where explanations mattered. But whatever she saw on my face seemed to stop that before it started. "I didn't want it to happen like this," she said, her voice careful, measured, as if the shape of the sentence could soften what it carried. I nodded slightly, not because I agreed, but because I understood that we were already past the point where intentions made a difference. "I know," I said, and I meant it in the most literal way possible. I knew what had happened. I knew how long it had likely been happening, and I knew that none of it existed in isolation from everything else that had led up to it. There wasn't a fight. There wasn't a moment where everything broke all at once. Instead, there was a kind of quiet sorting decisions lining themselves up one after another, not driven by anger, but by a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar in how steady it was. The next morning, I called a lawyer, not to ask what I should do, but to begin the process of doing it. We went over the prenup I had signed before we got married, the structure of the house, the accounts, the timelines, details that up until that point had just been part of responsible planning, but now felt like the only parts of this that still followed a clear set of rules. By the end of the week, papers were filed. I changed my passwords, redirected my mail, and packed what mattered into a few boxes that fit into the back of my car, leaving the rest behind without feeling the need to account for it. I blocked my parents' numbers that same day, not out of anger, but because I understood that if I left the door even slightly open, they would step through it with the same expectations they always had. And I wasn't going to explain myself into a role I had already decided to leave. For the first time, I wasn't trying to fix anything. I was removing myself from it. And what I didn't realize yet was how much would start to fall apart once I stopped holding it. Together. At first, nothing happened, which, in a strange way, felt exactly like something was happening, just not in a way anyone could point to yet. like the kind of shift that starts beneath the surface, where everything still looks stable if you don't look too closely. But the structure has already begun to give. My parents didn't stop calling right away, and for the first few days, my phone would light up at regular intervals, my father's number, then my mother's, then a message from an aunt or someone from church asking if everything was okay. The concern always phrased carefully, as if they were already aware that something had gone wrong, but didn't yet know how much they were. Allowed to say out loud. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't see the calls, but because I understood what answering them would turn into a conversation where the goal wasn't to understand what had happened, but to guide me back into a version of it that felt more acceptable to everyone else. So I let it stay quiet, and eventually the quiet started to spread. Sam, stepping down from his roles at church, didn't go unnoticed. No matter how gently it was framed, and when my wife and I stopped showing up entirely, it created a kind of absence that people in a small congregation don't ignore. They fill it, piece by piece, with whatever explanations make the most sense given what little they can see. My father tried to get ahead of it. That Sunday, he adjusted his sermon, weaving in something about moral failure and the importance of handling sin with grace rather than spectacle. And while he never said names, the message wasn't as contained as he seemed to believe it would be. Because people listen differently when they suspect something is being hidden. They lean in. They connect details. They notice who's missing. And once that starts, it doesn't take much for a narrative to form, especially in a place where reputation carries as much weight as truth. Attendance dropped slowly at first, then more noticeably. Families pulling back just enough to avoid being directly involved while still signaling that something had shifted. And the conversations that used to happen openly in the parking lot moved into quieter corners, into private messages, into spaces my parents couldn't control. Sam felt it, even without anyone confronting him directly. There's a way people look at you when they know or think they know something about you. And from what I heard later, he stopped staying after services stopped making eye contact, until eventually he stopped going altogether. He lost his job a few weeks after that. Not officially because of anything related to what happened, but in the kind of way that doesn't need to be explained when the timing lines up too cleanly to be coincidence, especially in an environment where personal conduct quietly shapes professional decisions. And through all of it, I didn't say anything. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't offer context or clarification or a version of the story that might have made things easier for them to manage. Because for the first time, I wasn't participating in the maintenance of something that had never really protected me to begin with, which meant that when my father finally found a way to reach me through an email I hadn't blocked, sent late at night with no subject line and just a single paragraph inside, it didn't feel like an attempt to reconnect. It felt like something else entirely. "If you won't help us repair this," he wrote, "at least tell me if destroying your brother was worth it." I read it once, then again. And after months of saying nothing at all, I replied. We met at the church on a weekday afternoon, long after the last service had ended, and just before a realtor was scheduled to walk through the building, which gave the whole place a strange in-between feeling like it was no longer what it had been, but not yet ready to admit what it was becoming. My father was already inside when I arrived, standing near the front rows with his hands in his pockets while my mother sat a few seats back, her posture smaller than I remembered, as if the space around her had grown too large to hold comfortably. For a moment, none of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the version of this conversation they had been hoping for didn't exist anymore. And I think on some level they could feel that before I even opened my mouth. "You didn't have to let it get this far," my father said finally, his voice quieter than usual, though still carrying that familiar certainty underneath. "We could have handled this differently." I nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of what he believed. "You did handle it," I said, my tone steady, not raised, not sharp, just not in a way that included me. He frowned as if that distinction didn't quite land the way I intended it to, and I could see him searching for something to push back with, something that would bring this conversation back into a space he understood. "This isn't about sides," he said. "It's about doing what's right." I let that sit there for a second, the words echoing faintly in the empty room, before I answered. "No," I said, shaking my head slightly. It's about what you needed. I reached into the folder I had brought with me, not to prove anything about the affair, not to relitigate what had already been decided, but to lay something else on the table entirely, and placed a small stack of printed emails and handwritten notes between us. He looked down at them, confused at first, until he started recognizing his own words. Messages from years back. You've always been the steady one, the one we can count on, the one who understands. I watched as the recognition settled in, not all at once, but gradually, like something clicking into place that he hadn't realized was part of a larger pattern. You didn't need me to understand, I said quietly. You needed me to carry it. My mother's eyes filled, but she didn't speak. And when this happened, I continued gesturing slightly toward the empty space around us. You didn't choose forgiveness. You chose the version of your family that still worked. That's not fair, my father said, though there was less certainty in it now. It is, I replied, meeting his gaze. Because if this had happened to anyone else, you would have called it what it was. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said. I wasn't your son in that moment, I added, not as an accusation, but as something that had finally become clear. I was the one you expected to absorb the damage so everything else could stay standing. No one argued with that. And I think that's when they understood that this wasn't something they could fix by saying the right thing. I stepped back, letting the space between us widen again, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left there for me to hold on to. I'm not coming back, I said simply. And as I turned toward the door, I realized that for the first time, leaving didn't feel like losing something. It felt like finally setting it down. After that, things didn't collapse all at once. At least not in a way you could point to and say that was the moment everything ended, but more like a slow unraveling where each thread, once pulled, made it harder to pretend the rest of it was still holding. The church closed within a few months, not officially because of any one incident, not in a way that could be traced back to a single decision, but because the quiet shift that had started weeks earlier never reversed. And eventually there wasn't enough left attendance donations trust to keep it standing. My father found work outside of ministry. My mother stopped answering questions she used to handle with ease. Sam moved back in with them, and from what I was told, he carried himself differently. Not louder or more defensive, but smaller, like someone trying not to take up more space than he already had. No one reached out to me after that, or maybe they did and I just never saw it. Either way, the distance held. And the strange part was, for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to close it because walking away hadn't been about making a point. It had been about finally stepping out of a place that had already decided what I was supposed to, carry. And once I stopped carrying it, there wasn't anything left there that belonged to me anymore. About a year later, I saw my father's name come up in a community newsletter not attached to a sermon or a church event, but listed among volunteers helping with a local counseling program. And for a moment, I just stared at it, not with anger, but with a kind of distance that would have been impossible before. My life didn't turn into anything dramatic after that. It just became quieter, more intentional, built around choices that didn't require me to disappear for them to work. And I think that's the part people misunderstand. Walking away isn't always about leaving others behind. Sometimes it's about finally staying with yourself. If this story meant something to you or felt familiar in ways you didn't expect, consider staying with the channel. There's more here than just stories like this.